it really did start when things got bad, and they got really bad here. Uh, we never really recovered from prohibition effectively, and then Roosevelt shut us down for 3 years, and then we had all the prohibitionists saying we shouldn't really restart distillation, even though the war had been over for a year. I mean, the enemies against this little industry were just massive. And so investment was hard to get. The whiskey wasn't all that good either. And I say that because my family was involved all the way back to the Revolutionary War as distillery makers and distillery owners. Uh, and when Dad decided to start up and to start with a taste objective as opposed to a commercial objective.
How did he come to that insight? Like, did he
Well,
just want to sell something he wanted to taste,
he
or
didn't
did
sell it at all. He had to have something to do. He was retired. He's 43 years old. He had enough money to retire. He was. Mom said, "You got to go do something. Now, you're not staying around here. I don't need you to run the farm." And so he never could get his father, when they came out of prohibition, to, hey, perfect time. Let's change what we're doing so it actually tastes better.
Right.
And Granddad wouldn't do it. He said, we're going to keep doing the way we've always done it. You know, people are thirsty. They'll drink pretty much anything. But they didn't. Scotch
Right.
whiskey came in, and a vodka was invented in the late 40s, and California wines and rums and all. So the bourbon shares shrunk. And not only that, the reputation shrunk faster, just like Michael said. And so when he started in 53, it was the beginning of a very quiet, it's what we call the quiet phase.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there's, Michael is looking at the trailing indicators.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to give you the leading indicators. Right. And he said, we're going to make a bourbon. This is a hobby. It is not a business. It is for people that don't like bourbon. And I'm going to reach out to my competitors, all of whom are up here on the wall. And they agreed to help him. In later years, we found out part of the motivation. And I mean, many late years, we found that Dad's palate, he had a super sensitivity to bitter. About 20% of the population does, where they don't like bitter. Well, bourbon is a backmouth experience.
Yeah.
So when he
So
says
he thought it was especially bad. In other words,
he thought that's exactly, he thought it was worse than it actually was. And he was talking about his own. He wasn't talking about other people's. Yeah. But he couldn't understand why his grandfather didn't see it the way he saw it. Well, their palates were different. And so that drove him as much as anything. We're going to take bourbon and we're going to reinvent it. And it is going to be, it's going to be front palate. We're going to tone down that stuff in the back, and we're going to accentuate from the midpoint of the tongue forward. And all of that, bringing that idea down to something that you could do something about, was these four guys. I mean, Dad acknowledged to the day he died that there wouldn't be a maker's mark, there probably wouldn't be a bourbon revolution in the form it's in, without those four guys and Mom helping him figure out how to create that distinctive taste that's makers.
What was their contribution? How did they?
All right, it was in a lot of ways. He never talked about it much, but remember, I got to go with him.
Right.
So I was with him when a lot of those things were going on. I was also 13, 14 years old and wasn't paying any attention. But there were so many of them. It was I remember these are guys that all had technical backgrounds. I mean, they worked in a technical environment,
right,
and they were technically trained. Dad's a mechanical engineer, Mom's a chemist. So that whole team was pretty smart, pretty experienced, and pretty well educated in things involving biology and
right,
chemistry. So they could talk to each other in ways normal people couldn't. And they realized that the first thing they needed to do, they needed to define what the hell he was talking about. And this is before anybody knew that he had this super sensitive to bitter. But they figured out fairly quickly that he didn't like bitter and he didn't like high sour. So you know, so what the way they went at it, they broke it into three pieces.
Okay.
Because this is the way science is solved. You take it and you break it up into independent variables, and you push them back together at the end. So I said, we're going to start with the ingredients, and that's a box. And the next box is the process that goes on in the distillery. Next piece of the process is the maturation piece. Okay, but before we get into any of that, we've all got to have the same idea of what winning looks like. When it comes out the end, what are we looking for? And they finally ended up deciding that the taste should be at the tip of the tongue. And that was a challenge because there's never been a bourbon that did that. They didn't want all the flavor there. They just wanted that to be the epicenter.
Right. Now, how do you? This will be old hat to you, but I think most people. How do you change? How do you control for where the taste will be in your mouth? I mean, what is it that makes it?
This is an oversimplification,
Yeah.
but everybody has the same concentration of taste buds in the same location in their mouth. Okay?
So certain tastes will trigger certain.
Bitters in the back,
Okay.
sweets in the front, and sour runs around the ridges of the tongue, going from a cinnamon sour to a bitter sour as it goes, but graduated from cinnamon, which is nice, to bitter sour, which is hardly distinguishable from bitter, all the way to the back. And then you have salt right in the middle of the tongue, which doesn't come into play. So you could say there's really only three taste variables, although one of them is a real variable. That's the sour part.
Okay.
Okay. So, and of course I'm leaving out the important things of consistency. Right. Bourbon is made by the batch. Batch stuff is very hard to make consistent. But if you just lay that aside and say that has more to do with the attention to detail.
Right.
And now we're really talking about the creation part of the process. And they very quickly, especially Pappy, I think, played the biggest role here. They all offered their yeast, which was nice. Pappy had experience using wheat. Bourbon is traditionally made with rye and corn and malted barley. Pappy's the only one that had experience with wheat, and he said there's these various varieties of wheat. We'll play around. I don't know how they're going to play around, but you probably want to tone down the rye and put some wheat in. Well, by the time the discussion ended, they decided the rye needed to go all the way out because rye is sour.
Okay.
I mean, you notice that the difference between rye bread and wheat bread. It's on the sides. It isn't bad, but it is on the sides, and it's the back to the sides.
Okay.
So all flavors that are the back point of the mid of the tongue, they don't need to go away, but they need to be softened. And so Mom got the idea, well, if you're going to take the rye out, and you can't do this by trial and error, you got to get it right the first time. Why don't we just bake some bread with the alternatives? And so she did, and these guys, they did blind taste. The first baker's blind tasting was bread; it wasn't whiskey. But they were looking for directional indicators on where it would land on the palate.
Okay.
Okay, so it's the only thing they had. It was Mom's idea, and so they said, "Fine, it's better than nothing. It's better than guessing."
Right.
Okay, so that's what the differences were very subtle, and they ended up deciding that the rye would be replaced with red winter wheat, which in Kentucky is ground cover. It's about the last thing you'd have ever landed on if you hadn't gone through a process like that.
Huh.
And so that was kind of the first piece. The second was, okay, what yeast are we going to use? And they didn't have to decide that till later. And these distillers were nice enough to give us some of theirs. And Dad had saved ours, saved it with a brewery in Louisville. He actually had it stashed in 3 different water refrigerators
Huh.
around Kentucky, all during Prohibition. and after they'd sold it, so it had been in somebody else's hands in Donny kegs for 10 years, and he ended up using his fathers and grandfathers, and I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was sentimental reasons,
Right.
because he tore up everything else. He tore up the formula, how we did everything, and then the process was okay. We got all this modern technology coming in. You got pressure cookers, you got stainless steel, and you got the hammer mills. All that technology came about 1950, and in most cases, it made a bad situation worse. So they decided on a slow cook. They decided to cook the grain separately so that you don't overcook the wheat, which is one of the problems where you release these dibasic alcohols and fusel oils and furfurols that actually cling to the back sides of the tongue, which is what he wants to get rid of. He said, well, if we tone down the cook them separately, it's a longer cook. And if we distill at a lower proof, we can leave more of those flavors that we're creating in the cooker by the slow cook.
Right.
So that's when he decided on 120 proof. And of course, remember, bourbon was going through this thing. Oh my God, we're selling less and less. We have to be more efficient. So we cut out the second distillation. Well, we put that back in the pot, the doubler that's in the basement. Now all bourbons use doublers. Nobody uses stainless steel, and they've all gone back to being concerned about making it better.
Right.
But that all started right. Dad didn't have the commercial pressure because he wasn't trying to make money, and everybody else had to cut the corners because the market wasn't there, and really nobody cared too much about what it takes. That's a horrible thing to say about the bourbon drinkers that were left.
Right.
But the fact is, they were all going to the cemetery fairly quickly. They were old. They were all in the South to speak of, not too well educated. And I always thought when I came in, you could see that group dying. You could see the emerging new bourbon market, which I don't think either one ever saw the other.
Yeah. Because
they were so different demographically, psychographically, education-wise, everything.
Did you?
It's how do you get from 53 when you start in this room essentially to 59 when it first went out on the market and nobody cared, and I mean nobody cared, and Dad would just the only people that got it were the people, his friends, the boards he was on and things, and then all of a sudden University of Kentucky professors discovered it, and then it came to Louisville at the university. And then next thing you know, it's a big deal in Kentucky. And then here it is, 1980, and here comes Dave Garino from the Wall Street Journal down to talk to Dad, and he never talked to the press. Yeah. He did 3 interviews in his whole life. And
who were the other two?
One was with the Kentucky Beverage Journal, and the other one I think was with the Oklahoma Kansas Beverage Journal.
Oh, okay, cool.
Back in the early days.
Yeah.
And Garino ended up spending 3 days down here. Was absolutely fascinated. What's this guy doing? Jimmy Carter was president, if you remember. Everything
I went and found that article and read it. Yeah.
Everything was screwed up in the country.
Yeah.
And here's this guy down here just ignoring all of it and clicking along, growing. Granted, the market was just Kentucky. It was his friends, but he had a lot of friends. And when that went, every big, significant watering hole in the country had to have a bottle.
Yeah.
That was the moment. That's when the grass was on the turf. Okay, it was. That's when the light bulbs went on at many of the fine restaurants in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, San Francisco.